So hello and welcome, a warm welcome to all of you who are joining us from different parts of the world today. My name is Taraneh Rusta, and on behalf of Voices of Women for Change, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us. Voices of Women for Change is a nonprofit organization with the goal of empowering women to overcome gender-based discrimination and violence, and to promote gender equality and gender justice through advocacy and consciousness raising. Please check us out on voicesofwomenforchange.org. You can also check our social media and you can connect with us through social media. But today we are so honored to join hands with outstanding human rights and women's rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Miss Magazine, Feminist Majority Foundation, Women and Gender Studies of California State University, Women Research and Resource Center of California State University, Northridge, Campaign for Human Rights in Iran, and the Amnesty Local Group 1023, to collectively advocate for Narges Mohammadi's freedom. There is a quote that says, she was powerful, not because she wasn't scared, but because she went on so strongly despite the fear. And this really captures Narges's bravery, strength, and her grace as she stands up for freedom and human rights in Iran, risking her own life. So now it is a moral imperative for all of us to stand up for her freedom and defend her human rights. We are calling on you to activate the most powerful medium, your social media, to shed light on Narges's situation, who's being tortured in solitary confinement as we speak. We ask all of you to hold up a sign with or without your own images with the statement #Free Narges Mohammadi and post it to your social media widely. You can post it to your Instagram, Facebook, Twitter account, but please do it widely. This is the least we could do for a woman whose voice and whose existence is a threat to the Islamic Republic of Iran. So they have locked her up again. And it is our responsibility to turn the light of truth on the dark corners of their heinous prisons. As Frederick Douglass, one of the vocal defenders of human rights, said so eloquently, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. So let's demand Narges Mohammadi's freedom. With that, we're gonna kickstart the campaign today with showing the screening Narges Mohammadi's documentary film, Why Torture, which is based on the chronicles of her own book with the same title. After we show the film, we're gonna start the panel, but I just want to share with you that in order to honor Narges Mohammadi's request, we only showing and screening the film today on this medium, on Zoom meeting. And even though the whole program is being live streamed through Facebook, and we're going to be recording everything, we will not be recording the film, and we will not be live streaming the film. So if you're here, you'll get to watch the film, and then hopefully in the future, it may be available in other platforms, but she specifically requested that the film be shown in certain platforms such as ours today, and not to be put on social media. So let's start watching the film together, and I will see you all on the other side. So at this point, I would like to introduce our distinguished guests and speakers. First of all, I want to thank every single one of you for your participation and for your collaboration. I'm going to briefly start introducing them, and then we'll go around the panel based on some of the questions I have for them. One of the first guests is Elise Auerbach. She is the Amnesty International USA specialist for Iran, and she is the coordinator of all the work done by the US section on Iran. She received her PhD from Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at the University of Chicago. Elise also worked closely with other country specialists and the Refugee Casework Committee to provide support to the asylum seekers. Our next guest is Seperifar. She is the acting Deputy Washington Director and a researcher in the Middle East and North Africa Division of Human Rights Watch. As the acting Deputy Washington Director, she conducts advocacy before the US government on human rights issues in the Middle East and North Africa region. And as a researcher, she investigates human rights abuses in Iran and Kuwait. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, she was the Deputy Director of the Human Rights in Iran unit at the City University, New York. Dr. Naire Tohidi is a professor and former chair of Gender and Women's Studies and the founding director of Middle Eastern Studies at California State University, Northridge. She represented women NGOs at the UN-sponsored 3rd and 4th World Conference on Women in Nairobi and Beijing. She has also served as a consultant for the UN agencies on issues concerning women and children's status in the Middle East. Dr. Mansour Farhang, he is a human rights activist, retired professor of political science, a Human Rights Watch advisory board member for the Middle East and North Africa, and a member of Campaign for Human Rights in Iran. And last but not least, Mr. Tariq Rahmani, an Iranian journalist, writer, and author of books on religious intellectualism and reason, and of course, a spouse of Narges Mohammadi. So welcome to all of you, and I'm going to start with Mr. Rahmani, and I'm going to ask him to give us an update of the latest on Narges's status. آقای رحمانی خیلی خیلی خوش آمدید به جمع ما و ممنون هستیم که به ما این فرصت رو دادید که در حضورتون باشیم و بتونیم اگر که خبر جدیدی از اوضاع نرگس دارید، از وضعیت قانونیش، از وضعیت پزشکیش که با ما مطرح بکنید.
من سلام عرض میکنم خدمت همه دستاندرکاران برنامه و همه کسانی که تو این پنل حضور دارن و یا دارن نگاه میکنن. ببینید الان ما داریم با نزدیک میشیم به اینکه 60 روز نرگس در انفرادی 209 وزارت اطلاعات و ما هیچ خبر موثقی درش نداریم و حق گرفتن وکیلم نداریم. در حقیقت الان نرگس در جایی است که براش مبارزه میکرده، یعنی سلول انفرادی هم برای شاید برای مخاطبان ایران غیر ایرانی باید واژه ایزوله رو به کار برد، چون انفرادی، زندان‌های انفرادی در کشورهای غربی یه امکاناتی داره که اصلا سلول انفرادی به شکل ایزوله در ایران نیست و زندانی از همه چیز محروم.
Let me he said that Narges continues to be in solitary confinement without much contact with the family or anyone else, and the solitary confinement has a different implication in Iran, where there is deprivation from everything. So and she continues to be there. بفرمایید آقای رحمانی.
ببینید همونجور که تو این فیلم هم هست، تلاشی که نرگس برای مسئله زندان انفرادی کشید با نسل من یه مقدار متفاوته و برای اکثر مردم هم این مسئله شناخته شده نیست، ولی در حقیقت یک درد وحشتناکیه که اگه چیز باشه من توضیح میدم، البته در 2 قسمت توضیح میدم.
He says that everything that Narges and this generation have gone through is different from what I have experienced in my generation. There's this excruciating pain involved in this that if I have time, I will explain. آقای رحمانی، شما میدونم آخرین صحبتی که با نرگس داشتید ایشون وسط صحبتاشون تلفنشون رو قطع کردن. میتونید بگید که مکالمه‌ای که با ایشون داشتید ایشون چی گفتن به شما و راجع به چی بود؟
با ما مکالمه با ما نمیدونه مکالمه کنه، فقط میتواند به برادرش در ایران زنگ بزنه و ما از جانب اونا نقل میکنیم. نرگس در تمام این مدتی هم که قبل از زندان بود با من ممنوع مکالمه بود، چون منو یک مجرم فراری میدانه جمهوری اسلامی و اونم یه زندانی سیاسی. حتی وقتی با بچه ها صحبت میکرد اجازه نداشت، اون موقع که بیرون بود با من، اون موقع که تو زندان بود با من صحبت کنه. فقط تو 1 سال آزادی من می‌تونستم با نرگس صحبت کنم. این تماس تا با برادرش گرفته میشه و در اون تماس گفته شده که من از شکایت میکنم از بازجوهام و از مسئول شعبه 2 زندان دادسرای زندان اوین شهید مقدس، چون بازجوها به من میگن همه اتهامای تو علنی است. خب وقتی اتهامای من علنی، چرا من دارم، چرا الان نزدیک 2 ماه من در سلول انفرادی هستم که این مکالمه 1 دقیقه بوده که به خاطر این جمله که من شکایت میکنم قطع شد.
I asked him about the most recent conversation he had with Narges, and he corrected me and he said he's never been able to talk to Narges while she's been in solitary confinement. The only time that he can get some news about her is when she's allowed to apparently communicate or relate to her own brothers. And according to the brother, when she was having a conversation with him, as she was saying that I want to file a complaint against the prison ministry and the security forces, the phone was disconnected basically, and they disrupted the conversation. So, but he's never been allowed to talk to Narges except for the few months that she was outside and she was free. Merci, بفرمایید.
ببینید، مبارزه با سلول انفرادی برای نسل من 14 سال زندان کشیدم و بیش از 1 سال نیم در سلول انفرادی بودم، 6 ماه، 4 ماه، 3 ماه. ما در اون نسل خود ما سلول انفرادی قسمتی از مبارزه می‌دونستیم و کشیدنش برای ما طبیعی بود. من افرادی بودم دیدم 2 سال 3 سال سلول انفرادی کشیدن، ولی نرگس یک نگاه حقوق بشری مسئله انفرادی وارد کرد، نگاه منم عوض کرد. ببین، من اعتقاد دارم سلول انفرادی وسیله‌ای است که حکومت هنوز ازش برای اعتراف گرفتن استفاده میکنه و هنوز کارکرد داره. این قسمت چون منم موافق بودم، ولی این قسمتی که حق ما انفرادی کشیدن نیست، در ذهن منی که در دهه 60 مبارزه قبل از انقلاب مبارزه کرده بودم، این قسمتی از مبارزه بود. حقوق بشری‌ها این دید رو عوض کردن و راحت رو این دید توجه کرد. این قسمت اول من در مورد اینه که ترجمه کنید، من توضیح میدم قسمتش.
He basically says that his generation looked at solitary confinement as part of their struggle, as part of their struggle for freedom, for democracy. And Narges's stance on solitary confinement is quite different. She's looking at solitary confinement from the stand of human rights issues and abuse of human rights. And I would explain more, but I just want to say that she was able to change my mind because I no longer look at this as part of the struggle and it is abuse of human rights. So go ahead, بفرمایید.
ببینید، وقتی که شما فعال مدنی هستی و فعال سیاسی هستی، چیز زیادی برای مخفی کردن نداری، زیاد نمیدونن کف پا کاپ بزنن. من خب شکنجه شدم. خب وقتی که کف پای شما کاپ میزنن و اون درد رو حس میکنی، وقتی میاندازن انفرادی احساس میکنی که خب اینجا یه فضای بهتری از اونجاست. ولی وقتی که انفرادی طولانی میشه، داستان دوباره عوض میشه. ببینید در دوران جدید به خصوص بعد از سال 1970 که شکل مبارزه در ایران سیاسی مدنی شد، سلول انفرادی بسیار کارکرد پیدا کرد برای بریدن زندانیان و شکستن عزت نفسشان. خب این نرگس که اولین بار که اومد تو سلول انفرادی که تو بند مردها بود، یعنی 59 سپاه، همون بغل دست سلولی من که آوردن، وقتی که من مواجه کردم با نرگس توی اون سلول انفرادی، حالتی که به من دست داد، فقط من یه جمله بهش گفتم ورزش کن و مقاومت کن و تمام میشه. ببینید اصلا شما حساب کنید یه زن بیارن تو سلول مردها تو انفرادی در کنار مردهای دیگه بیانزنش توی سلول انفرادی، این فشاری که به اون میاد و فشاری که به تو میاد. 1980 این رخ داد. همین وقتی کنار هم میذاری به نظر من خیلی خوب درک کرد به عنوان فعال حقوق بشری که باید با این مبارزه کنه. اما چرا میگم مهمه؟ بسیاری از مردم سلول انفرادی ندیدن، درک نمیدن. این مردم، خیلی از مردم میدونن حس کنن شلاق و کابل کف پا زدن چقدر دردناکه، ولی خیلی اصلا حسی از ایزوله بودن ندارن. همونجور خیلی از خارجی‌ها فکر می‌کنن سلول انفرادی منظور اینه که طرف میاندازن توی سلول انفرادی، حمام داره، روزنامه داره، رادیو داره، مثلا اینا بره ورزش. نه، سلول انفرادی یعنی تو ایزوله میشی و قرار تو اونجا بشکنی و اون که بازجو می‌خواهد بشوی. ببینید اینجا حس انتقال این به حتی به بسیاری از مردم ایران خیلی سخته. من خودم اینو تجربه کردم. و کتک که نزدن که، زیر گوشت که نزدن که، کف پات که نزدن که، ولی نمیدانن که بقول حالا همون که چیز که میگم تو خالی میشه اونجا. من آدمایی دیدم که سلول انفرادی مقاومت میکنن، ولی اکثرا سلول انفرادی حکومت ایران جواب گرفته و یکی الان مؤثرترین ابزار شکنجه است. به دو شکل: یا طرف ول میکنه و خسته میشه، مبارزه نمیکنه، یا این که به اصطلاح طرف میشکنه. هر دوش مانع از فعالیت سیاسی مدنی میشه و نرگس اینو خوب گرفته.
اجازه بدید ترجمه کنم. He basically says that the government of Iran is using the solitary confinement as a means of torture, as a means of getting confessions from the prisoners of conscience. And he says, I've been in prison myself for 14 years. I've been flogged. I've been tortured. And these type of physical tortures, people can relate to it. People can understand how painful that might be. People do not have any understanding of the solitary confinement and the way it not only is sensory deprivation, but also it violates humans' dignity. And so Narges understood this very well. Narges understood that solitary confinement is more than just being in a single room with perhaps some access to some books or newspapers. It is not that. It is more than that. It is a form of torture. So basically, he's elaborating on the nature of solitary confinement and why Narges perceives that and is advocating that it is a form of torture. But since we're going to be talking about that at length with other panelists, I'm going to wrap up this conversation with Mr. Rahmani and just ask him if he has any ask for this panel. آقای رحمانی، چون اتفاقا قراره که آقای دکتر فرهنگ یه مقدار مفصل‌تر راجع به همین نکته‌ای که شما اشاره کردید، یعنی در واقع تفاوت سلول انفرادی و چرا این شکنجه هستش، بیشتر صحبت بکنن. ولی میخواستم ببینم آیا شما از این جمعی که در اینجا حضور داره، جمعی که اینجا هست به غیر از سازمان‌های حقوق بشری و سازمان‌های زنان، افرادی هستند که همه تعلق خاطر دارن به حقوق بشر، به آزادی، به دموکراسی. و آیا چیزی هست که شما از این جمع بخواین، پیامی برای این جمع دارید؟
ببینید یه چیز خود نرگس خیلی خوب درک کرده بود. همیشه میگفت بعد از اولین زندانش میگفت من آزاد بشم ولی نهادی نداشته باشم، این آزادی چه فایده‌ای برای من داره؟ یعنی ببینید در ایران ما تلاش میکنیم یه فعال حقوق بشر آزاد میشه، یا فعال سیاسی آزاد میشه، یا فعال مدنی آزاد میشه، ولی حزبش و نهادش غیر قانونیه. این یک نوع آزادی دروغینه، آزادی در قفسه. این همیشه اینو میگفت اهمیت نهاد من از من مهمتره. من حاضرم زندان باشم ولی نهادم میتونه فعالیت کنه. معمولا در کشورهای یه خورده پیشرفته اگه یه نفری کاری میکنن دستگیر میکنن نهاد چون نمیبندن که. مشکل ما اینه که دموکراسی سیاسی در ایران معطل دموکراسی مدنی است. ما همواره دموکراسی سیاسی خواستیم بدون دموکراسی مدنی. بدون دموکراسی مدنی این دموکراسی نهادی در جامعه مدنی دموکراسی سیاسی نمیاد. فعالان حقوق بشر مثل نرگس و یک سری فعالات صنفی الان که ایران هستن این آرام دارن میفهمن و مزه میکنن. دموکراسی مدنی خواست من اینه که اون خواست ما اینه که اونایی که فعال حقوق بشرن، فعال مدنی هن، نفوذ دارن با نهادهای بین المللی، با نهادهای بین المللی که میتوانن یا نهادهای ملی حقوق بشری که میدونن بر دولتشون فشار میارن. ببینید آزادی های مدنی و حق تشکل، حق تجمع، این ابتدایی ترین خواسته ماست که ازش محروم. معلم‌ها، بازنشسته وقتاشت آبتین دیروز کشتنش در حقیقت. چه قانون نویسندگان ایران با 70 سال 60 سال سابقه هنوز مجوز رسمی برای فعالیت نداره. هیچ جریان بیرون از حاکمیت در ایران چه مدنی چه صنفی حق فعالیت نداره. جمهوری اسلامی قاتل نهادهای مدنی است، با ایجاد بخش عمومی و بسیج قاتل نهادهای مدنی است. خب بدون نهادهای مدنی حزب سیاسی کارایی نداره. ببینید یکی از تلاش‌هایی که نرگس میکرد حمایت از این نهادها بود. این قسمت به نظر من مهمتره، یعنی صدای نه فقط نرگس شدن، صدای کسایی که میخوان نهاد مدنی مستقل در ایران داشته باشن، نهاد سیاسی مستقل در ایران داشته باشن. فقط خودشان نیستن. اگر این نهاد نباشه این خود مثل اسفند روی آتش مدام باید جلیزه ولیز کنه و بسوزه تا برسه به اون نهاد. چون اگه اون نهاد آزاد نشه و حق فعالیت نداشته باشه، آزادی فردی که دغدغه کار سیاسی مدنی داره خیلی سخت و زندان دلچسب نیست. یکی از چیزای نرگس همیشه این بود که در کنار طرح افراد از نهادهاشون هم حمایت کنید و این خواسته باشه که نهادهای مدنی و سیاسی در ایران باید حق فعالیت داشته باشن. جمهوری اسلامی واقعیت اینه که نهادهای مدنی دشمن خودش میدونه. بعد از زدن احزاب سیاسی الان همه نهادهای مدنی زیر فشار هستن، حتی نهادهای خیریه مثل جمعیت مومنی. خیلی ممنون.
He basically says that why civil rights organizations, civil rights activism should take priority over even political freedom or political democracy. And he is quoting Narges that she always said, without the civil rights organization and civil rights movement, democracy is meaningless. That we have to have civil rights organizations in Iran in order to be able to advance the democracy in Iran. And the Islamic Republic of Iran is the #1 enemy of any kind of civil rights activity, movement. And this is my message for the world, to support and to promote and advocate for civil rights activism, civil rights movement, civil rights, the right to express, the right to gather, the right to speak freely in the society like Iran. مرسی آقای رحمانی، خیلی ممنون از حضورتون دوباره در جمع ما. Next I'm going to go to Dr. Farhang. Dr. Farhang, what is the solitary confinement really? We all know it's sensory deprivation. Why is it considered? Why torture? Why Narges so passionately is trying to make a point that solitary confinement is not just another room with limited access to the outside world. It's more than that. And it's been said by some people that there are solitary confinements in other Western countries, even countries with democracy. But we all know that the solitary confinements are not equal. So what is it about the solitary confinement in Iran particularly, and why is it white torture?
Thank you very much. Let me begin by thanking Voices of Women for Change, and particularly Ms. Taraneh Rusta for organizing this conference. I hope my comments will make a contribution to the appreciation of viewers of...
Sorry, can you say again one more time? 1128?
I beg your pardon?
If someone has their mic open, please make sure to mute yourself because we can hear you. Sorry, Dr. Farah, I think someone had their mic open.
Anyway, I hope my comments will make a contribution to a deeper appreciation of this extraordinary, revealing, and educational documentary. As a human rights activist, I feel grateful to Narges Mohammadi for producing this. Let me say that according to Article 5 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, quote, "No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment." And in 1984, United Nations Convention defines the term torture to mean any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining information or confession. Indeed, prohibition against torture is a bedrock principle of international law. It is banned in all places and times, including in times of war. These definitions or descriptions provide a conceptual definition of torture, but they do not adequately decipher the purpose and consequences of it. That is what Narges Mohammadi show the documentary is actually explaining to us. While torture begins with interrogation, white torture, like any other, begins with interrogation, which includes methods that do not physically assault the body or cause actual physical pain, but it entails ever psychological suffering and disrupts the senses and personality of the victims. Sleep deprivation, total isolation, denial of visions or reading material, dark or highly lighted room day and night are among the sociopathic tools used to break the resistance and personality of the victims. The idea is to make them confess to fictitious stories or lie about other prisoners of conscience. At times, female victims, inmates, are asked to describe their sexual acts in detail in exchange for freedom or transfer to general prison. These interviews are videotaped and shown on television news programs in order to humiliate and embarrass the victims. The inhumanity of white torture process is endless, and the damage to the mind, memory, and sensibility of prisoners continue after they are released or moved to the general prison. In fact, lasting impact on the mind and behavior of the victims is an intended purpose of white torture. The focus of our discussion tonight is solitary confinement, Iran's prison system, and the plight of prisoners should be studied empirically in order to illustrate the socioeconomic injustices caused by the only theocracy in the modern world. As Nelson Mandela, the man who spent 27 years in prison to end apartheid in South Africa, said, quote, "A state should be judged by the way it treats its prisoners." The Islamic Republic is not an ordinary dictatorship. It is the only constitutionally established theocracy in the modern world. The clerical rulers reject the very idea of human rights and expect the citizens to submit to the duties and obligations prevalent in Arabian Peninsula 1400 years ago. Any act contrary to these pre-medieval rules is a sin subject to punishment. The regime has created a massive coercive apparatus to interfere in both the public and private spheres of life. Women can be arrested and accused of committing sin for the way they dress. Even listening to the music of one's choice is considered a sin subject to punishment. In 1979, the year of the Islamic Revolution, Iran had 38 million population and about 14,000 prisoners. Today, the population has more than doubled to 82 million, but the number of prisoners has increased to 240,000 or 20-fold. I should add that solitary confinement is also practiced in democratic societies. Reasons for this policy in America and European prisons have to do with violent behavior or mental problems of inmates. Such prison policy can be legitimately criticized, and there are both national and United Nations-based efforts to reform and limit the policy. Some Western observers compare this practice with what Narges Mohammadi shows us in White Torture. This odd equivalent distorts the reality. It is like comparing cats with snakes. Human beings can influence cats' behavior, while the snakes have their own alternative facts and reality. The propagandists of the Iranian regime contend that they are not affected by international exposure of their human rights violations. If this is the case, why do the regime's propagandists and their lobbyists abroad spend so much time and resources to deny them? Narges is at this time in solitary confinement. It is fair to say that she personifies the suffering of all prisoners of conscience in Iran. We must expand our efforts not only for her freedom alone, but for freedom of all prisoners of conscience. As individuals, we might feel ineffective, but as members of a group committed to sustain activities, we can make a contribution into an international movement committed to supporting Iranian prisoners, that Narges and other courageous human rights activists are fighting for inside the country. I just want to conclude by saying that I hope this conference is going to generate an activity not only among Iranian dissidents abroad, but also human rights supporters internationally. The situation in Iran is uniquely pathological, and it is very important that it receives particular attention from human rights organizations across the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Farhang, and thank you so much for reminding all of us that what we do, what we say matters. We can have an impact on the situation of the prisoners of conscience in Iran. We all need to hear that often. Next, I'm going to go to Elise, the Iran specialist for Amnesty International. Elise, no one needs an introduction for Amnesty. Everyone knows Amnesty International as one of the longest institutions for advocating for human rights. So Narges has been in solitary confinement, I believe, since November 16th. So if you do the math, it's a little bit less than 2 months. So I know that Amnesty has been focused on this issue and her plight for the right of the political or the prisoners of conscience. So what is Amnesty doing right now? Or if there's something that has been done in the past that has been impactful, and if there is any upcoming plans to put more pressure on the government of Iran to release Narges.
Yes, well, thank you. First of all, I'd also like to thank Voices of Women for Change, and I'd like to thank all the other panelists. And I'd certainly like to thank Mr. Rahmani, and especially I'd like to thank Narges for her incredible example of courage. It's always an inspiration to me. Narges has actually been imprisoned several times, so she's very aware of the consequences of her actions. So, you know, she was actually released from prison after several years of being in prison in October of 2020. And, you know, I think most people would have excused her if she just decided to lie low and take care of her health, because she suffers from so many health problems that were caused by her periods of detention and the ill treatment. But instead of just resting and lying low and taking care of herself, what did Narges do? I mean, she spent more than a year showing up at protests. We saw her standing with a bunch of other former prisoners of conscience, and she was actually arrested in November of 2021 while she was protesting the extrajudicial killings of a number of protesters in November of 2019. They had been engaging in mostly peaceful protests, and dozens of people had been killed by security forces. And so Narges was actually arrested while she was protesting this. So, I mean, I will say honestly, over the years, I get sometimes I get frustrated and demoralized because it's just like Sisyphus rolling a big giant stone up a hill trying to work on Iran. You know, you work so hard on one person, and every time, you know, you have a victory with one person, you know, you still know that there are hundreds of prisoners of conscience who remain in prison. But whenever I think about Narges and how courageous she is, I always think, well, if she can go on, if she can be so brave, and she always works on behalf of other people, not on behalf of herself. So I figure, you know, I have no right to lose my own focus on human rights in Iran, because she's just such an incredible example to all of us. So Amnesty has worked on the case of Narges Mohammadi for many years. Again, she has been arrested, imprisoned many times. And we have actually been able to win her, with the help of activists around the world. We've been able to get her released. Again, most recently she'd been released in October of 2020 and was out of prison for a little over a year until she was rearrested. But the reason why the authorities released her in the first place was because of all the pressure. And so it's really, as Dr. Farhang noted, the Iranian government actually does very, very much care about what the international community thinks about them. They spend an enormous effort, for instance, when Iran is having its universal periodic review at the United Nations, they send a huge delegation of people to try to convince the international community that they're actually following international human rights law, even though we know that they're not. So among the techniques Amnesty uses, we have activists all over the world, and it's really, really important to just constantly bombard the Iranian government with letters and doing protests and actions. Again, we've won the release of Narges. Nasreen Sotoudeh, for instance, is another person, a very prominent person, and who's been imprisoned a number of times. And she was released a few months ago. Fortunately, she has not been called back to prison. And I'm quite convinced the reason why the Iranian government released her in the first place and has not called her back to prison is because of all the activism of people around the world who've put so much pressure on the Iranian government. And one other thing that we have to remember is that activists are calling for the Iranian government not to do something unusual. What we're calling for them to do is that they must abide by international human rights conventions and treaties that they themselves have pledged to abide by. So we're just holding them to their word. They have agreed to abide by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They have agreed to abide by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And the other thing, I might want to contradict Dr. Farhang a little bit. What Amnesty International works on human rights violations in every country around the world. So it's really important that all countries are held to the same standard. So for instance, the United States does sadly, in many different states, confine people in solitary confinement. Just today, there was a story on NPR about how New York might actually reimpose a solitary confinement, which had been banned under the previous mayor's administration. And they were just talking about how one young man who had been arrested for stealing a backpack wound up waiting for his trial at Rikers Island for like 3 years. And he was put in solitary confinement. Then when he was released, he sadly committed suicide. So he experienced severe psychological stress under solitary confinement. So the point is, we have to hold all countries to the same standards. So we're not picking on Iran. We're not singling out Iran. Every country is expected to abide by human rights treaties. And I just want to also just mention another case of an example of a case where we did have a lot of success, and that was the case of physicist Omid Kokabi. People may remember that Omid Kokabi was doing doctoral work at the University of Texas when he was arrested. He had been visiting his family and he was planning to go back to Texas, and he was arrested, and he was actually held in prison for several years. And Amnesty International worked on a campaign in collaboration with the Committee of Concerned Scientists and the American Physical Society. And we actually generated, we actually got a number of Nobel physics laureates to sign letters to the Iranian government. We collected tens of thousands of petitions and letters on behalf of Omid Kokabi, and we actually were able to deliver these petitions and letters to the Iran UN mission in New York, and we also held an action outside the Iran mission's plaza in New York, and eventually, actually not too long after that, the action was in October of 2014, Omid Kokabi was actually released. Now, you know, we don't always have successes. It's an uphill battle, and very often it takes several years of concerted activism. Fortunately, we have an incredible number of wonderful committed activists, and actually see several of them among the participants, people who've worked for years on people like Narges Mohammadi. But I also want to underscore, you know, it isn't so important to work on individual prisoners of conscience, individual cases. But what we really have to do is we have to work towards convincing the Iranian government that they have to make systemic changes to their legal system. For instance, we have to get rid of the revolutionary courts. We have to stop having people like Narges Mohammadi and Nasrin Sotoudeh and others tried by revolutionary courts for these so-called security-related offenses. You know, people in these proceedings are charged with ridiculous, nebulous offenses like propaganda against the regime, or gathering and colluding to undermine the regime, or insulting the supreme leader. These are vague, nebulous offenses, and they lead to you know, unfair trials in revolutionary courts. We have to get rid of practice of using torture, torture to gain confessions, which are, as Dr. Farhang noted, very often televised. We have to, again, pressure the Iranian government to release individual prisoners of conscience, to end executions, and then, you know, other things that Amnesty International has done. We've always supported the annual resolution in the UN General Assembly to condemn Iran's human rights abuses. We've supported having the term of the special rapporteur on Iran to be renewed, and we also do a number of actions. If any of you want to get involved with Amnesty, one thing a very important action we do every year is a so-called Nowruz action. We do it around the beginning, the first day of spring, to celebrate Nowruz. Very often, we've had a lot of success. Narges has actually been the subject of our Nowruz actions in the past, and I can, if Narges is not out of prison by March, we will certainly include her in this year's Nowruz action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elise, for sharing your thoughts, your experiences, and your wisdom with all of us. And thank you again for participating in this event. Now we're going to go to Ms. Tara Seperifar. Tara, as you know, represents the Human Rights Watch. Tarajan, as someone who represents such a significant human rights organization, what do you think is the significance of the direct engagement and the activism on behalf of the organizations like yours, like human rights organizations and human rights activists, like pretty much everyone who's here? Why is it so important? And the reason I'm asking that question is because lately I'm hearing a lot of people voicing disappointment, voicing the activism fatigue, feeling that nothing works, nothing is happening, no change is happening. So why should we continue?
Thank you, Taranajan. Like other speakers, I want to just briefly thank the Voices of Women for Change for getting us together to watch this incredibly important documentary made by Narges and having this conversation. And in the interest of time, I go ahead to answer your question. Otherwise, I can spend time thanking every panelist for their remarks. And I know people are in different parts of the world, and for some of them, it might be late right now. Today is particularly difficult day to answer this question because the Iranian human rights community is mourning the death and the tragic and unjust death of Baktash Abtin, a poet and writer who was in prison for his involvement with the Writers Association and contracted coronavirus twice while in detention. And unfortunately and very sadly lost his precious life yesterday in a hospital in Tehran while authorities delayed his vital access to medical care for days. So it is a very sad day to see the real cost of standing up to authorities in Iran and fighting for human rights. The charges he and his co-defendant faced were exclusively about their involvement with the Writers Association and their participation in memorial and anniversary ceremonies of the assassination of dissidents, writers and dissidents, and also Ahmad Shamlou, just to give the audience a sense of the ridiculousness of the evidence used against these people. A writer who was writing was sentenced to 6 years in prison and he never came back from detention. But I want to stress the fact that this is exactly why direct engagement matters. As Elise explained, this is a very uphill battle. We can't always secure the release of individuals we want to see released immediately. But directly, we have numerous testimonies, dozens and dozens of anecdotes from political prisoners when they're released, that direct engagement does matter in terms of improving the condition of detention. From ending solitary confinement, granting access to family visit or family call, access to medical care, it does matter. And for some people, it can be literally the matter of life and death. So interventions and being able to actually generate pressure on the Iranian government to take action can actually meaningfully save someone's life. It's important to acknowledge that the Iranian government has over time built a very high threshold for scrutiny. So our job is getting more difficult by day, and as different narratives are being broadcasted and access to information is more than ever, and as everyone's attention span, including ourselves, is more limited, keeping sustained attention on these cases is difficult, but it's important because it meaningfully impacts the situation. And the other point I want to make is the continuation of what Mr. Rahmani was saying about the importance of Iranian civil society and preserving whatever space that's possible for them to do their activism. So on one hand, the direct activism is about the condition of the individual. On the other hand, is about keeping the pressure on in a hope of preserving the limited space that Iranian civil society activists are so hardly fighting for. Whatever we think of the solution to improve the situation might be, the people we saw in the movie, they come from very different backgrounds. Many of the people in this audience are closely familiar with them, and some might not be. They don't necessarily agree on solution. They don't necessarily belong to the same political party or the same civil rights association, but they're all fighting for keeping the agency of the Iranian society to push for change. And I think it's on us to make sure the cost of imprisoning these people for the Iranian government remains high. We shouldn't allow that to be normalized. We shouldn't allow that to be dismissed as yet another fact within the context of policy or foreign policy with Iran. We should make sure that wherever we come from and however we think the change should happen, I think our collective duty where we sit around this table is to help preserve that space in Iran and help empower the people who are fighting for creating that space and fighting for it. I think what was very impressive about what Narges was trying to do over maybe just over slightly over the year, maybe even, it wasn't even a year that she was not in prison. She was trying to bring people together. She was through the documentaries, through visiting families. She understood the importance of people working together. And that's exactly why she is such quote unquote threatening figure for authorities. She's being interrogated for her efforts to file a legal complaint against the solitary confinement. So I think on a secondary level, our direct engagement is also a reminder and an effort to help them preserve that space. And as difficult as it might be, as hard as it can be to remain optimistic, myself included, it's extremely difficult when you don't see a clear path to convince the Iranian government to make these systematic changes. We all take inspiration from stories of individuals inside Iran, as well as people in other side of the world, other places in the world, considering that the fight for improving human rights is going to be a long one, started way before us in Iran. It's going to last regardless of how the situation is inside the country. But I think to the extent that it's possible for human rights defenders to protect their mental health, but also do whatever they can, they should consider their work meaningful. It's just that you might not see the impact right away. But it is very important for us to continue doing, and I think it sends a very strong message to people who are fighting inside Iran. It was part of the documentary as well. I think it was one of the Baha'i leaders who ended up spending time in prison, who said that when he heard that the whole world was caring about this case, it made a huge difference. So I think we also owe it to those people who are fighting in situations that is much more difficult than our situation to continue doing this.
Thank you so much, Tarajan, for all the wisdom imparted on us, because I think, as you said correctly, it is so important that we won't lose sight of the long-term impact all of this activism is going to have on the situation in Iran. So sometimes we're not going to get the result we want immediately, but we cannot deny the impact that all this has on what goes on in Iran or countries like Iran. So thank you so much again for being part of this panel. And now I'm going to go to Dr. Tohidi. Dr. Tohidi, thank you so much also for your participation, for your support, for your collaboration with this campaign. I just want to know, what is the significance of someone like Narges? Because clearly we could do a campaign on a lot of people. And since we are a women's organization, there's a lot of women that we owe it to them to do similar campaigns and bring more light, bring more awareness to their situation. But since we're focusing on Narges today, what is her significance for the civil society in Iran? Her significance for advancing human rights and civil rights in Iran?
Thank you, Taraneh. Let me also begin with thanking the Voices of Women for Change, and also all the panelists, and especially the human rights organizations, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, because without them and similar organizations internationally, and the international pressure brought about by those organizations, we would have more prisoners dying, like Aktash Abtin, who died today after 2 years being in prison, just for being a critical writer and poet. And without those international activism and pressure on the government of Iran, we wouldn't have Nasrin Sotoudeh today in a parlo, to take time for her treatment, medical treatment. And that's why I have witnessed several important positive impact. So we shouldn't give up the hope and decide, as you said, on the impact, and especially long-term impact. I know it requires patience and persistence. That is one of the things I wanted to talk about. Unfortunately, others already did. And since we don't have much time left, I will only talk say something with regard to your question, why Narges Mohammadi, why we are focusing on her, although we always want and demand the freedom and release of all political prisoners and all prisoners of conscience. But there are certain activists whose persistence, whose courage, whose non-sectarian approach to civil rights movements, to human rights movements, have made them kind of symbols of a whole human rights movement, civil rights movement in Iran. And Narges is one of those symbolic figures who, when we talk about her, we are actually talking about the whole problem of repression in Iran and the whole problem of lack of space for creating civil society organizations. The very important point that Mr. Tariq Rahmani made, and Narges in all her efforts and speeches, for example, the speech she gave during the acceptance of the Sakharov Prize by the Physical Society of America, in her writing that I read during that event, she emphasizes the importance of being able for Iranians to organize, to have, to institutionalize civil society, because without institutions, without organizations, civil society is like dormant, cannot do much, and we cannot create democracy. We have had, since the inception of the Islamic Republic in the past 42 years, Iranian society activism through the civil society, continuous waves of civil rights related protests and movements, presenting the concerns, grievances, and issues of the laborers, students, teachers, women's rights advocates, ethnic and religious minorities, environmentalists, farmers, nurses, caregivers, pensioners, and the like. So, but the problem is that due to the authoritarian nature of this state and its widespread repression, Iranian society suffers from the lack of well-organized and stable civil society organizations. So that's why people, especially women, such as Narges Mohammadi, who started as a professional engineer and at the same time a leading advocate of civil rights and women's rights, is a prominent and inspiring example or role model of the growing agency of people, especially women in different professions, like women lawyers, women writers, and women artists, women singers, women who have fought for freedom of choice, for dress code and things like that, all represent very vibrant engagement of civil society members. But beneath women like Narges, who emphasizes the importance of building democracy and organizing, getting together. She, as Elise said very well, that she could have taken some break from activism and take care of herself after her release, which wasn't even longer than a year ago. But she continued networking. She continued connecting former prisoners and even current prisoners together to mobilize a new movement, a new civil society action, which is about solitary confinement, and why it is called white torture, and why it has become the primary tool of forcing confessions, fictitious confessions on the prisoners and breaking their soul, killing their soul, and altering their personality. And it is different from physical torture, but it has more long-lasting, permanent, sometimes a negative impact. In the last 20 years, Narges has been either a founder or an active member of 11 non-government organizations that had worked toward institutionalization of civil rights and human rights. I don't want to name all those organizations because I don't have time, but the last one that she engaged in and created or led was the Unity Against Solitary Confinement, which is related to the film we just saw. She also did 2 volumes of book on that theme and actually mobilized prisoners, former prisoners and current prisoners, dozens of them for the first time registered their complaint legally against solitary confinement. Because what this kind of torture, or any torture, including this mental torture, psychological torture, is prohibited not only by in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also in the Constitution of the Islamic Republic itself. So that is why this discourse is building, and Narges has been able to generate a new consciousness, a new awareness of the human rights of even among the prisoners. As Mr. Tariq Rahmani said, in his generation and in the even past 10 years, people thought, okay, white torture or solitary confinement is not even torture. They thought that's part of the struggle and they have to endure it. But now they realize that it is not. It is a torture. It is actually a primary torture. In Narges, in one of her writing, she said that there is the need to build and achieve true civil society. In the last 25 years, this is when she was accepting the prize. I have been active in 11 civil society organizations, either as a member or as a founding member. Now, with great regret, I see the doors of these organizations being closed and sealed by the government. Yet I am not hopeless, nor have I lost my motivation. We cannot stop trying. I still hope and deeply believe that the tireless efforts of our civil society activists will eventually bear fruit. I am awaiting the moment I can rejoin my colleagues in these activities once I am released. The path to democracy in Iran lies not through violence, war, or military action by a foreign government, but through organizing and strengthening civil society institutions. The government knows this only too well. It is fearful of non-governmental civil society organizations precisely because of its undemocratic nature. It cannot even tolerate unions such as Association of Iranian Journalists or human rights organizations such as the Defenders of Human Rights Center that Narges is the vice president of, or even charity bodies like the Association in Support of Working Children. So that is why her emphasis, this civil nature of Narges' persistent struggle has gained a lot of support among various groups and various, ideological inclinations among Iranian societies and also internationally. In addition to national support, she has been, and in national support by that I also include Iranians inside and outside Iran, but Narges has become a very much supported figure by progressives in the US, Europe, and other parts of the world, and she has been awarded many prizes and so forth. So I think one of the reasons behind popularity of Narges and respectfulness of her and respectability and trustworthy status among various bodies of civil society and social movements in Iran, such as women's rights movement, labor rights, environmentalists, ethnic, religious, and sexual minorities, as well as political groups that are critical of the status quo. It is because Narges Mohammadi is a uniter, not a divider. She has been helpful in converging progressive groups rather than diverging them or polarizing them. She's not a polarizer. She has avoided sectarianism and been keen on building coalitions across ideological and political orientations. She has been very tolerant of diversity and respectful of pluralism. These are precious characteristics, unfortunately rarely present among many leading politicians in Iranian mainstream political culture. Narges is a secular Muslim. Her religion seems to be of a non-sectarian, non-clerical, but spiritual, semi-mystical or pantheistic nature. Unlike many unidimensional activists, Narges is fond of arts, music, singing, dancing, and life beauties. She was once received with kind of cold surprise and even criticism by some people because of her appearance in social media, dressed up, wearing makeup and looking joyful, right after coming home from Evin prison for a brief break after a long ordeal in a prison and a short-lasted hunger strike. In response, she made a statement saying, "I wanted my mother to see me in a good and happy shape. I want to be happy as much as I can. Even in prison, we can and should create happy hours and enjoy life. We do not want to perpetuate the suppressive culture of the current rulers and their denial of pleasure, music, love, and dance." In her own way, Narges is part of the growing counterculture in Iran that stands against the violent and aesthetic culture preached by the fanatic Islamist extremists, a generally life-affirming culture that is fond of pursuit of happiness, liberty, and equality. That is what Narges promotes. Unlike religious extremists among the current power holders who sacralize asceticism or hypocritically pretend in public to be ascetic, pious, and strict men of God, but in private do many wrong things, Narges is among those who believe we should honestly and openly promote beauty, happiness, nonviolence, and joy and love. So here, I see that my time is almost over. I want to again encourage us and remind us about the importance of national and international campaigns for the freedom of and saving lives of people who are in prison, especially given that because of many years of Narges being in prison, her health has declined and she developed an epilepsy-like disease, causing her to periodically lose muscle control. After a month, she was released and allowed to go to hospital when she experienced that during one of her prison times. And this was, again, thanks to the pressure that international community of human rights groups and individuals put on the government to release Nasrin before she was close to, dangerous stage in her health. I'm making I have written a lot of references to why pressure by international organizations concerned with human rights work, but I don't have time to go through all of them. So let me end here by showing a few T-shirts that we used to wear when Narges, and a similar one we made for Nasrin Sotoudeh too, and several other prisoners, when she was in jail during her last imprisonment. We had a lot of, I don't know if this can be seen by the camera here. We made t-shirts like this, calling for freedom of Narges. Several of her pictures and with different t-shirts, asking people, and wherever we went to the conferences, wherever we wore this to remind people about Narges. And when they didn't know her, that was a good occasion. When they asked who she is, we started talking about her. So we can engage in campaigns, specific campaigns like that. Maybe you, Taraneh Jan, have other ideas, but I want to perhaps leave the event, before leaving the event, come up with some ideas what to do specifically to put pressure on the government of Iran before Narges contracts another coronavirus again, or becomes ill and her life gets in danger. We can do something to have her released. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tohidi. And thank you for, again, emphasizing that activism does matter and what we do does matter. In terms of the actionable item, as I mentioned in the beginning, we really hoping that we can flood the social media with the images of Narges Mohammadi, with the statement #Free Narges Mohammadi, or you could just write #Free Narges Mohammadi and post it to your social media widely. Because let me tell you something, they do take notice. The government of Iran, they monitor the social media. And if they see that the social media is flooded with certain messages, they take notice, they take note. And that is the best form of pressure that we could put on the government to know that we are watching, that Narges Mohammadi and many other prisoners of conscience are not forgotten. And this is the best form of exposure. So I really want to invite all of you to not only do it yourself, but please communicate with your family, friends. Let's explode the social media with these images of #Free Narges Mohammadi. Also, I think it's so important to get engaged with different women's organizations, human rights organizations, and please go to our page in Facebook, Voices of Women for Change, and like our page, because this way, whenever we post something, you're going to be notified. Again, I can't thank you enough. We're so grateful for our panelists, for all of you who spent your Sunday evening with us on this important issue. Thank you so much and have a great evening, and let's keep in touch.